Remember that false colonization and false manifestation does nothing to destroy God's intended colonization and God's intended manifestation of destiny. There is manifested destiny, and there is spiritual colonization. And the goal of colonization is the expansion of the kingdom through spiritual influence, not through the use of military might. There's a place for military might, there's a place for policing, and there's a place for, in the terms of government, bringing justice. And those come with swords, according to Romans, according to Jesus. They have swords for war and swords or violence or force, which can be, in fact, a force that produces death. Government has the ability to execute people dead. The death penalty is biblical. And the government has the right to use a sword, and they don't have swords to shave. They have swords to stop people who do evil and to be a terror to them so that they won't do evil. And what government does is provide a peaceful and safe one. This is what Paul says we should pray for from government, a peaceful situation in which the spiritual aspects of the kingdom can gain cultural influence. And of course, we have enjoyed that in the United States, and other civilized nations have enjoyed that. But we have not eradicated the horrendous and the horrific from history, nor from the world today, and nor have we produced perfect society, perfect culture, perfect government, perfect anything. We haven't produced perfect kingdom, nor perfect ecclesia. So of course, without a complete ecclesia, we don't have a completely functional and ultimate expression of kingdom. Therefore, we don't have an expression of ultimate authority that Jesus has, and therefore we have fallen short. But that doesn't change one thing about the design and purpose of God. And that's where we start. So when the deep calls to the deep, let me jump way ahead and say this. When God manifests glory, His glory is everywhere. But when He manifests glory, it's because He's properly represented. So Zion can be anywhere, any people with any place, at any time, when a remnant of God's people properly represent Him, that He will manifest His glory, and the knowledge of His glory can fill that place. People may not serve God, but they'll be aware. And Jesus rules in the midst of His enemies by spiritual means and spiritual influence, because He has a remnant that expands. How big can that be? Well, I've been to cities of 250,000 where just one kingdom ministry had 55,000 people who were adherent to the way of the kingdom. And other ministries in which that city, like Ephesus, at the time of Paul, 250,000 people, how many people were in Ephesus, were so turned that they had revival and riot, that there was such a change in the culture, change in the economy, with economic impact, that the existing culture, economy, was so threatened by this that they had a riot, and they continued to have this kind of upheaval until the temple of Diana, their god, fell to the ground. And then these people began to understand that the prevailing spiritual condition no longer defined Ephesus. It was no longer had the identity, Ephesus no longer had the identity of one of the seven wonders of the ancient world, the temple of Diana or Artemis. And that culture so changed that it became the center of Christianity for the entire world for more than 150 years, until about 200 years later, then something began to throw the whole thing back into its original condition, spiritual condition, and that's why Ephesus does not exist today, and it's a part of Turkey, a predominantly Muslim nation, because of the failure. But the purpose of God for Ephesus and that region, Asia Minor, did not, and was not, it didn't disappear, and it's not destroyed. It still remains. And so Greece is in a mess. Turkey is in oppression. So what happened to those purposes? Well, God sent them to the Americas in other people. And through their having children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, the lineage kept the investment of these purposes available to the people who live in the Americas. Not destroyed, but preserved. So when the deep calls to the deep, two things happen. Things that God has treasures he has hidden in nations surface, because there's somebody who can inherit them and begin to develop them. So Jesus said in the vision, and of course this is much longer than I'm in much more detail, but he said this: they came from Europe with greed. And so it wasn't the only people. I mean, here in Jacksonville, the French Huguenots came here for refuge to get away, and then they were slaughtered. They were sent out from France because they were Christians at the same time that Spain kicked out all the Jews, 1492, and then thereafter Europe began to release. Jews began to disperse, to get away, and some of them landed in South America, made their way up through Central America, through what is now New Mexico, Taos, New Mexico, in fact, and ended up in New York through a migration of the Jewish people. But at the same time, Huguenots, French Huguenots, who were the revivalists, Pentecostals, the prophets, the dancers, they landed here in Jacksonville, Florida, and then established here, preached the gospel to the First Nations, Temucuans, first. So we have the first gospel preaching, first convert, first dance, first worship, first prophecy. Everything first was here in the first coast. Then they were slaughtered by Roman Catholics, Spaniards. But my point being that Europe came, and he said, predominantly Europeans came here in greed. I mean, they came here because they discovered great timber, great fishing, great natural resources. Then they found gold, and it was all over. So people come in here and they claim the land for Spain, or I claim this for England, or I claim this, And we have this big fuss over it, which doesn't have anything to do at all with what was going on, until a different kind of remnant stood up and made a declaration of independence. And still, we don't have perfection here. We don't have a remnant from the kingdom, but we do have enough kingdom influence. Listen carefully, enough kingdom influence that the purpose of God was intact. And guess what? Amazingly, the Declaration of Independence, it still contains enough information consistent with how God works, consistent with the scriptures, that it still tells us the purpose of God now, these many hundred years later, or many decades later, not hundreds. And the same is true of the Constitution. The Constitution of the United States still says we have inalienable rights that come from our Creator. Even with a sordid history that still surrounds the fact that we have not been dominated by kingdom culture as we should. So in other words, if you were to go back and begin with 1776 with kingdom and kingdom culture being the dominant prevailing spiritual condition, that didn't happen even in the First Great Awakening. That didn't happen even in the Second Great Awakening. But you saw enough of it in both those awakenings that you realized that this nation had inherited these purposes. So he said they came from Europe with greed, but I'll send them back giving. And that America will become a giving nation. Well, of course, that's been fulfilled, because we've given, as a nation, we've given more money, more resources, more help, more military might. We saved Europe, and we saved Asia. We didn't do much to save Africa, but we definitely had an aspect in both Asia and Africa because of what we do to save Israel. However, you see these things in form. If you have prophetic eyes, prophetic discernment, and you look past the natural world, you look past the pagans, you look past the heathens, past the people who are filled with greed, you see that in the midst of it and in spite of them, God is doing something about his purposes. Then he said they came from Africa in slavery, and this is true of all the Americas and even the islands, that the people of Africa came to the Americas because of slavery. And I can guarantee you that Jesus 100% opposed to what happened to those people, not only while they were in Africa and at the hands of Africans, what happened to them when they were sold into slavery, brought across them boats, and if they made it, sold into slavery again, and the islands, and then the East Coast, and then the South. And of course, it's true in Brazil, especially, but also in Central America, all the places in the Americas where slavery brought people from the continent of Africa. God opposed slavery. God didn't cause it. He didn't have an intention of it. He never thought, well, wouldn't it be great? But God then, who is not in control of that nor causing it, is in charge of the outcomes of that. So what God said, they came from Africa with slavery, I'll send them back giving. I'll send them back with freedom, excuse me. Came from Europe with greed, I'll send them back giving. They came from Africa with slavery, I'll send them back with freedom. And we haven't seen that yet. We've seen aspects of it. But when we say freedom for Africa, we're also in the same way having to address the fact that there are nations there that dominate the land, worshiping gods and witchcraft and idolatry, and with religions and cultures completely adverse to, contrary to, and in rebellion with the kingdom culture. So when we go to Africa, we're not there as a nation or as a people to assist in Antichrist. By Antichrist, let me tell you that I'm not talking about a person of the future. By Antichrist, I mean the conspiracy that started in Eden and continues throughout all the history to keep Jesus from getting his inheritance. The nations belong to him. The Antichrist spirit's job, focus is to keep Jesus from getting what he wants, and that's why the prince of the power of the air is doing. He's not motivated by all the other things. Satan isn't greedy, and Satan isn't an idolater, and Satan isn't, all the things that motivate humans do not motivate him. Satan is a liar, and he lies to himself. He's a deceiver, and he deceives himself. And so he has an overly developed sense of optimism that he's going to win. And he thinks because of the leverage he has in nations that he's winning now. And he continues to work. That's how things go on in the spirit. And we are not ignorant of his methods because he hadn't learned much of anything over the years. But what little he has learned, he's only become more deceptive and a bit more organized. But in fact, Satan continues to make ridiculous blunders that totally reveal him for what he is and then say, oh, well, we know who's doing that. That's a work of hell. So Jesus said they came from Europe with greed, and I'll send them back giving. They came from Africa in slavery, but I'll send them back with freedom. They came from Asia looking for a home, which is very true, but I'll send them back to establish kingdom. And so Asia is waiting for a generation which will produce the kingdom of God in a very special way. The structures of those nations will lend themselves to kingdom structures much more easily than they have in the Americas, and especially in the United States. And that's because of European influence. Now, that's what I heard in the vision. So I went back to the scriptures, of course, and I said, is this how God does stuff? Is God a colonizer? And of course, we know that's true. We know that apostles in particular and evangelists were often assigned to places, and they would go there and they would not plant churches. They would go there to establish kingdom. And our best look at that is Acts 19 with Ephesus and Asia Minor. We know that's true because in the Revelation, Jesus is walking amongst them. Holy Spirit emphasizes, he put a spotlight, Holy Spirit who's in charge of writing the scriptures. He spotlights that. He spotlights it in Acts, and he spotlights it again in the Revelation. that John sees and records and we read today, because this is our understanding of what Jesus is doing and how he is working. And that's what we should be thinking now. This is how it was in this vision that Jesus stood up because he intended to walk in this fathering nation. And when he did so because he had ecclesia. He had functional revival movements with apostolic leaders who were producing, through discipleship, committed and matured believers who could function with spiritual power and authority at the international level, could speak to regions, territories, states, and a nation as an ecclesia. I'm not talking about the language of Brazil when I'm talking, although that language is coming. In spite of the influences of the United States, that language is coming because that's the way in which this awakening has occurred and will continue to mature and blossom as Brazil becomes the #1 missionary sending nation on the earth. They'll go to Europe, and they are. They'll go to Africa, and they are. They'll go to Asia, and they are. Unfortunately, mostly when they come to the United States, they're overwhelmed by this culture instead of becoming, agents of change here. But God is using Brazilian leaders all over the nations and all over the world to expand the kingdom. And the less language of church growthism they have, the more powerful they become in doing that. That we're not here to accumulate believers, but to establish kingdom and train people to obey all Jesus' commands so that we can function as his proper representation in these nations of the earth. So in this particular time, when I'm speaking of the Great Commission, and I speak about United States of America, then I'm looking at a nation who had people from Europe with greed, people from Africa, slavery, and people from Asia looking for a home. And then looking at this nation as a place where all of the spiritual purposes of all the nations of those continents came here through those people with this God idea, that no matter how the people from those continents arrived here, or in Brazil, that those people, when they arrived here, will become part of fathering nations, or nations in which those people, their children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, would experience greater liberties and freedoms, and there would be more and more of an availability of kingdom maturity and more of a lineage of spiritual growth as fathers' hearts and children's hearts were turned toward one another, so that these nations, fathering nations, would become missionary sending nations. We would be international in our spiritual authority and raise people to that level and send them back in order to have influence to disciple nations, not just to accumulate believers and get people born again, but change cultures. Well, we were doing well until church growthism came along and told us to stop doing that. We were doing well until the influences of Darbyism came along in the Second Great Awakening and told us, about cessationism and dispensationalism. And so we've had many short circuits. We were doing well until progressivism came in the late 1800s and we turned us in to what 1913. We're now a consumer base. We're not a capitalist nation where consumerism is eating us up from the inside out and filling our entire lives and economy with completely inequities of outcomes, and many people are suffering, and the middle class is having an increasingly difficult time as they would in a consumer-based economy. And all those things need to change by cleaning the corruption out of Washington, D.C., and diminishing the influence of socialism. And I say all that to say, in conclusion, that everything God intended for the Americas is still available to us. That this is still happening in spite of all of this unbelievable opposition, all of which comes from Antichrist, all of which comes from hell. So to understand how to fix things, we need to understand what God wants to do, what God's willing to bless, where the power of the cross, the power of Holy Spirit, the power of redemptive obedience, the power of identification with Christ, from Christ, and identification with the kingdom, how that kingdom culture influences existing cultures, how we don't have white culture, black culture, Latino culture, we don't have subcultures, and we don't have church cultures, subcultures, and churchism, how we have a kingdom culture that answers to the king, in which we have a fully constructed ecclesia that then responds to him in operational integrity as a head, so that, if he says, move forward, we're not crawling, but we're walking or running, or when we mature spiritually so that we are a bride and he's the groom, and we complete the image of God in man, which is kingdom covenant marriage, as a mystery in the spirit, but as a manifestation of strong marriage, family, fathering in the homes of kingdom people, and the influences of that stability, thus creating actual wealth for every Christian family, in spite of what is going on in hell, because we live in a kingdom economy. If we adopt the king's culture by rejecting our own cultures, then that produces the basis for a unity agreement that moves us toward oneness. And in reality, we have nothing else. There is nothing else. And without that, we fail, because God doesn't have an alternative. So we're actually engaging in a lot of substitutes. We're trying to do a lot of things by cooperating with Antichrist. Because we have lost kingdom culture, and we've lost the vision and understanding of how God gets stuff done, and we've replaced the kingdom with church growthism, and thinking if we just get bigger and bigger churches with bigger and bigger campuses, next thing you know, those churches will be socialistic. They're going to, that's what we have now. We'll cooperate with the government, and because we have a lot of money, then we'll help the poor. People still think either think the government's supposed to help the poor, or the church is supposed to help the poor. And while both of those things are true, it's mostly the kingdom that should help the poor, but it's not to supply the needs of the poor, but to teach the poor how to not be poor anymore. I will always have poverty because of the activities of people continuously doing incredibly dumb things, making incredibly bad decisions. Not saying we're eradicating this world of sin or of the consequences of sin. We're going to have people who do things that wreck their lives, destroy their lives, and then we're going to have the simple-minded that must be taken care of. These are the sheep aspects of culture, in which people are too immature, or they are too simple-minded to take care of themselves, so we have to do it, and it will be done, and that's compassion. But no, there's not great blocks of humanity out there that don't work and are just given money. I'm not saying anybody wants that, or that's the goal of anyone. I'm saying, just as an example of the fact that, that's not how things work in the kingdom of God, even though they did in Marxist social justice movements that have destroyed Central America and most of the nations of South America. And of course, there's an attempt now to do the same thing with the United States, because there are other nations who intend to dominate. Now, finishing with this, God told me last year he's going to deal with China, because China's just taken over. And from a short period of time of about a decade, they went from 6-7% of the economy of the globe, the entire world, to more than 27%. And if we didn't stop them, part of the reason God sent Donald J. Trump was to say to China, stop it, no more. You're just dominating through tyranny and despotism. You're just taking over everything. You're stealing from everybody. You've raped African nations, and you've stolen our technology here, and you've gained access like pirates, and you dominate your people like tyrants, and no more of it. And so he reset an agreement, and when he did so, it positioned everybody in a way when the pandemic would mean China's economic influence in the world diminishes, and fathering nations will have a greater opportunity to reset their relationships with China, which is something that needed to happen. This is one aspect of what's happening right now. Then we had this great outburst before this coming election in which globalists and Antichrist forces used this scourge and pain and memory and mourning and grieving of racism that has blotted our culture for so many years. And they've used it now to attempt to a takeover, a coup. The Democrat Party had already attempted coups against the Constitution, against morality, ethical. They've been completely, they'd lied, they knew they were lying. That's not ethical, it's not moral, it's not constitutional, it's not biblical, it's not kingdom. It's devilish, and everybody knows it now. It's completely 100% certain that the Obama administration committed an illegal act, an unconstitutional treachery, and completely 100% lied and complicit with the media, in collusion with the media, to attempt to say something was true that was never true, and they knew it was never true from the first time they said it was true. It's not even something for discussion. It's 100% completely certified, proven without any ability, without deceiving yourself. You cannot deceive yourself enough unless you want to see that's not true. Who, what, when, where, that'll all be spelled out. But the reality is that this attempt of a coup, when it failed, was followed up with a pandemic, by hell, by Satan spiritually, then followed up by this outbreak because of one thing. Not the perfection of Donald Trump, not the beauty of the Republican Party, one thing. To protect this nation from what the Democrat Party is bringing in releasing of globalism or of Antichrist, the effort of hell to keep the United States from coming back into a restoration and reformation and becoming a fathering nation again, like Brazil, Australia, Singapore, Italy, and other nations of the earth that will join them as they overcome the same forces. So if we don't interpret reality, if we don't see history in this context, then we miss the opportunity. Excuse me. That's before us, and that opportunity is mercy. Remember, mercy is time as opportunity. Without mercy, judgment just cuts it off, it's over. Now, mercy allows for God's forgiveness, mercy allows for restoration, mercy allows for cleansing, and mercy allows time for change and transformation. All these things are radically available. And here I am this particular day, looking at the moment in which we live, saying, we have never had a better time, a better opportunity, or everything in place for the remnant of God to come together with kingdom power and authority and an ecclesia to speak with kingdom keys and see America restored. We are on the precipice of the greatest harvest of history, and we stand on the same precipice with the greatest possibility of immense and dismal failure. And I know the power of God can and will push us over. I've never been more optimistic about that. It's not a question of how or even if he'll do it, it's when, and then the how of it will be explained and become obvious to us after the fact. So in this moment, it's so easy to invest mental focus, emotional energy, strength of will in things that are never going to produce the outcome that God has in mind. It's like the disciples in the boat, overwhelmed by the circumstances, but unable to understand that the boat's trying to get to Decapolis to deal with the legion. In other words, the picture we have here is a classic example of Satan working to keep something God is interested in seeing happen from happening. There's a satanic interference, interruption, It is an interlude at times, but it is an intensification of a hellish strategy in which the hand of darkness is completely exposed for that moment when the hand of righteousness is going to be exposed. It is a showdown between God's people and Satan, not between God and Satan, because there are no showdowns between God and Satan, but it's a showdown between God's people and Satan, in that it looks like we're wrestling with flesh and blood when we are not. So, in that whole context and that big mouthful, I just expressed about 5 minutes of the vision I had that lasted an hour and a half, and attempted to apply what I've learned from the scriptures about how God does stuff and how he deals with nations with us on the basis of what Jesus was specific about Brazil and the United States of America, Australia, Singapore, and other nations. This vision is about them. I have an assignment to put kingdom centers on all the continents of the earth except Antarctica. I'm so far not assigned to preach to penguins, of which that I know of. But otherwise, I have a global assignment, or I have an international assignment. I wouldn't say it was global. And I don't know but 5 people in the whole world who have a global assignment. So please don't name your ministry global. You could have an international assignment, but some people have a global assignment and they haven't been across the street. So there are very few people who have a global assignment, and that's greater than an international one. So because I know I'm not assigned to all nations, and there are very few leaders who are. Now, finishing up quickly, because this is a very long teaching, and I intend to follow it up with another one, talk more about the vision. It brings us to a strategy. And the strategy is totally different than nearly any strategy that I'm hearing. When I speak about it, people just get offended. When I speak about it, people are like, shut up, you're talking about the wrong things. But I'm just telling you that after 50 years of ministry and the experience that I have, the vision I've enjoyed, and seeing God work as he has worked in Brazil and other nations who are ahead of us, that yes, I feel as if an elder in the kingdom with expertise and experience that I can and should and do have an assignment to say something, so I am. So I hope that you will hear this and have heard the entire video if you need to review it. But you also will share this with others who are strategic. I'm not asking for it to become viral, but I would ask that those who are strategic leaders, remnant leaders in the nations of the earth could hear this teaching, and we could grasp onto it and begin to work together in ways that will shift cultures. We can disciple cultures by seeing transform individuals, and apostolic didache, or the training of the people of the kingdom in all that Jesus commanded, so that that influence will also impact existing cultures in their personal lives, personal interactions, and families, economies, thinking, every aspect of culture and society will be shifted to what this book reveals about the intentions of the inheritor of the inheritance, Jesus of Nazareth, the Son of God. I'm Dr. Don Lynch. Thank you for listening.